I still remember the smell of wet wool and burnt sugar. It clung to the air that morning, the kind of morning that doesn't know it's about to become a memory. Rain had fallen softly through the night, not enough to flood the gutters, just enough to make the cobblestones glisten like old piano keys underfoot. I was 10 years old, standing on the platform at Liverpool Street Station with a suitcase too big for my hands and a name tag pinned crookedly to my coat. Thomas Ellis. Age 10, destination unknown. I didn't cry, not then. Crying felt like something that belonged to the life I'd left behind, before the sirens, before the blackout curtains, before Mum tucked a boiled sweet into my pocket and whispered, "Be brave, love. They'll look after you." She didn't say where they'd look after me. She didn't say how long. She just kissed my forehead, her lips cold from the wind, and walked away without looking back. I watched her coat disappear into the grey crowd, the hem flapping like a bird that had forgotten how to fly. The train wasn't like the ones in storybooks. No polished brass, no velvet seats. This one groaned as it pulled in, its carriages streaked with soot and rust, windows fogged with the breath of children already inside. There were dozens of us, maybe more, huddled in clusters, some clutching dolls with missing eyes, others gripping parcels wrapped in newspaper. No one spoke much. Words felt too heavy for the space between us. Instead, we listened, to the hiss of steam, to the clatter of boots on metal steps, to the low hum of adults trying to sound calm while their voices trembled at the edges. I found a seat by the window. The glass was cold against my cheek, and I pressed my face to it, watching London shrink behind us, its spires, its smoke, its familiar ache. The city blurred into watercolour. Grey roofs, black chimneys, the occasional flash of a red postbox, like a heartbeat in the distance. I thought of our flat above the bakery on Cheshire Street, of the way the ovens warmed the walls even in winter, of how Mum used to hum while kneading dough, her hands dusted with flour like she'd been kissed by snow. A woman in a navy uniform with silver buttons came down the aisle, handing out paper cups of weak tea. Her name was Miss Hargreaves. She had kind eyes, tired but kind, and a voice that sounded like someone who'd sung lullabies long after the children had stopped listening. "You'll be safe," she said, placing the cup in my hands. Her fingers brushed mine, warm, dry, steady. "Safe where?" I asked. She didn't answer. She just smiled, the kind of smile that holds more sorrow than joy, and moved on. Hours passed. The countryside rolled by, fields stitched together by hedgerows, sheep dotting hills like dropped buttons, farmhouses with smoke curling from their chimneys like quiet prayers. I tried to imagine living in one of those houses. Would they have a dog? A garden? Would they let me keep my coat on indoors? I still wore it, even though the carriage had grown stuffy. Taking it off felt like losing another piece of home. At some point I fell asleep. Not deeply, just enough to dream of Mum's hands, of the bakery bell, of the sound of rain on our roof. When I woke, the sky had turned the colour of bruised plums, and the train had slowed to a crawl. We were pulling into a small station I'd never seen before. No grand arches, no crowds. Just a wooden sign swinging in the wind. Ashbourne halt. Children began to stir. Some rubbed their eyes. Others clutched their belongings tighter, as if afraid the ground might swallow them whole. A boy across the aisle caught my eye. He couldn't have been older than 8, with hair the colour of straw and knees poking through his trousers. He gave me a nod, small, uncertain, and I nodded back. That was how we spoke then, in glances, in shared silences, in the unspoken understanding that we were all orphans now, even if our parents were still alive somewhere. We stepped onto the platform one by one, guided by Miss Hargreaves and 2 men in flat caps who looked like they'd stepped out of a photograph from another century. The air smelled different here, cleaner, sharper, laced with wood smoke and damp earth. A few villagers waited at a distance, arms crossed, faces unreadable. Some held signs with names scribbled in pencil. Others just watched, as if we were curiosities washed up by the tide. I stood very still, suitcase at my feet, heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Then a woman approached. She wasn't young, but not old either, somewhere in that quiet stretch between. Her hair was pulled back in a bun, her dress plain but clean, and her hands, I noticed, were rough from work. She looked at my name tag, then at me, and said simply, "You're Thomas, then?" I nodded. She didn't smile. Not exactly. But her eyes softened just a little. "Come on, then," she said, picking up my suitcase as if it weighed nothing. "Supper's nearly ready." I followed her down a narrow lane, past stone cottages with ivy climbing their walls, past a church whose bell tolled once, slow and solemn, as if marking the end of something. The road was quiet. Too quiet. No cars, no chatter, just the crunch of gravel under our shoes and the distant call of a curlew. Her house was small, with a slate roof and a garden gone wild with late summer. Marigolds leaned drunkenly toward the sun, and a cat dozed on the windowsill, one eye open as we approached. She opened the door without knocking, her own home after all, and gestured for me to step inside. The warmth hit me first, not just from the fire in the hearth, but from the smell. Stew simmering on the stove, bread cooling on the table, beeswax on the floorboards. It was a lived-in warmth, the kind that gathers slowly over years, not something put on for show. "Sit," she said, pointing to a chair by the table. "You must be hungry," I was. But I didn't move, not yet. I stood in the doorway, taking it all in. The ticking clock, the framed photograph of a soldier on the mantel, the kettle whistling softly on the hob. This was my new world. Small, ordinary, fragile. And yet, in that moment, it felt like the only real thing left in the world. She watched me, waiting. Not impatiently, just waiting. I took a breath, then another. And finally, I stepped inside. The door clicked shut behind me. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the leaves in the garden. Somewhere far off, a train whistle blew, faint, fading, gone. And just like that, I was someone else's child, not lost, not quite found. But here, alive for now. The first night in that house, I didn't sleep. Not properly. I lay on the narrow bed in the room she called the spare, wrapped in a quilt that smelled of lavender and mothballs, listening to the house breathe around me. Floorboards creaked like old bones settling. The wind tapped at the window like a polite stranger asking to be let in. And beneath it all, the steady tick of the grandfather. Clock in the hall, each second a tiny hammer tapping against the silence. Her name was Mrs. Eleanor Price. She told me that the next morning, over a bowl of porridge so thick, it stood its spoon upright. She didn't offer it with ceremony, just set it down with a clink and said, "Eat up. You'll need your strength." No fuss, no false cheer, just food and quiet, and the unspoken understanding that we were both learning how to be in the same room without breaking something. I learned quickly that she wasn't warm in the way I'd imagined foster mothers might be. No hugs, no pet names, no bedtime stories. But she was there, always. In the kitchen at dawn, stoking the range. In the garden at dusk, snipping herbs with a pair of rusted shears. She moved through the day like someone used to carrying weight without showing it. And maybe that's why I trusted her, even when I didn't understand her. Because she never pretended the world was safe. She just showed me how to live in it anyway. School started a week later. A one-room building, with peeling paint and a bell that sounded like a cracked teacup. There were only 12 of us. Farm children, mostly, with dirt under their nails and boots 2 sizes too big. They stared at me the first day, like I'd arrived from another planet, which in a way I had. I spoke differently, London sharp, vowels clipped like paper edges. I didn't know how to milk a goat or mend a fence or tell the difference between barley and wheat. But I could read and write and recite the kings and queens of England in order, thanks to Miss Pembroke and her ruler-tapping hand. That earned me a kind of wary respect. Not friendship, not yet, but space. Room to exist without being mocked. Tommy Briggs, the boy with straw hair from the train, was placed in the same class. We didn't talk much at first, but sometimes, during arithmetic, our eyes would meet across the room, and we'd share a look that said, "You too." It was enough. Autumn deepened. Leaves turned the color of rust and fire, then fell in hushed drifts that carpeted the lanes. Mrs. Price taught me how to gather kindling without snapping the green branches. "Only take what's already dead," she said, showing me how to test a twig between her fingers. "The living wood needs its chance." I liked that. The idea that even in taking, you could be gentle. She never asked about my parents, not directly. But sometimes, when I was washing dishes or shelling peas, she'd say things like, "Your mother must have been a good cook," or "You've got your father's hands, steady." I never corrected her. I didn't know if my father's hands were steady. I barely remembered him. He'd left for France in '39 and never come back. Officially, he was missing. Presumed. Unofficially, we both knew. One afternoon, I found a photograph tucked inside a book on the shelf. The country diary of an Edwardian lady. It showed a young man in uniform, smiling beside a woman with my eyes. On the back, in faded ink, Arthur and Eleanor Whitby, 1928. I didn't say anything. But that night, as I passed her chair by the fire, I saw her tracing the rim of a teacup with her thumb, staring at the flames like they held answers. Winter came early that year. Frost painted the windows by dawn, and the well froze solid for 3 days straight. We melted snow on the stove for washing. Mrs. Price rationed the coal carefully, stacking it like treasure in the scullery. "We'll manage," she'd say, whenever I glanced at the dwindling pile. And we did, not comfortably but with dignity. She taught me how to layer clothes, how to wrap my feet in newspaper for extra warmth, how to make 1 carrot stretch into 3 meals. Christmas was quiet. "No tree, too much bother," she said, but she baked a small cake with dried apples and a spoonful of precious sugar. We ate it by candlelight, the flames casting long shadows on the walls. After supper, she handed me a parcel wrapped in brown paper and twine. Inside was a wool scarf, knitted in uneven stripes of blue and grey. "It's a bit lopsided," she muttered, not meeting my eyes. "First time I've tried." I wrapped it around my neck right then, though the room was warm. It itched, but I didn't care. It was the first thing anyone had made for me since I left London. That night, for the first time, I dreamed of home without waking up crying. Spring arrived like a secret. First, a single snowdrop pushing through the frost. Then daffodils nodding in the breeze. The stream behind the house, frozen solid for months, began to chuckle again. Mrs. Price started the garden in earnest, turning the soil with a spade that groaned with every thrust. I helped, my hands blistering at first, then toughening into something useful. One day, while weeding the rows of onions, she said, "You're staying." It wasn't a question. Not quite a statement either. More like she was testing the words out loud, seeing how they sounded in the open air. I looked up from the dirt. "Am I?" She straightened, wiping her brow with the back of her glove. "Unless you'd rather go back." I thought about London, the sirens, the rubble, the silence where my mother's voice used to be. Then I looked at her hands, cracked and earth-stained, at the house behind us with its crooked chimney and sagging porch, at the cat now dozing in the sun with one eye open. Just for me. "No," I said. "I'd rather stay." She nodded, as if she'd expected nothing else, and went back to her work. But later, when I brought her a cup of tea, I saw her standing at the kitchen window, watching the garden, and her shoulders were softer than I'd ever seen them. That summer, the war felt far away. Planes still droned overhead sometimes, distant and purposeful, but they never dropped anything near us. We listened to the wireless in the evenings, Churchill's voice crackling through static, news of battles in places I couldn't find on the map. But here life went on. Beans climbed trellises. Bees hummed in the clover. Tommy Briggs and I built a raft from scrapwood and nearly drowned in the mill pond trying to launch it. Mrs. Price scolded us both, then made us hot cocoa with extra marshmallows to warm our foolish bones. I started calling her Eleanor in my head. Never out loud, not yet. But it felt true. Then, one August afternoon, the postman came. Not unusual, he passed through twice a week. But this time, he handed her a letter with a War Office seal. She took it without a word, closed the door, and walked straight to the back garden. I watched from the window as she stood by the apple tree reading. The paper trembled in her hand. She didn't cry. She just folded it slowly, tucked it into her apron pocket, and went back to pruning the roses as if nothing had happened. But that night, when I passed her room, the door was ajar, and I heard her whispering, not praying, not exactly, just speaking softly to the dark, as if someone might still be listening. I never asked what the letter said. I didn't need to. Some silences don't need explaining. They just need to be held. And so I held mine for her, for me, for the boy I used to be, still standing on that platform, waiting for someone to say his name like they meant it. Now, someone did, even if she never said it out loud. The war didn't end with a bang in our village. It ended with a sigh, the kind you let out when you've been holding your breath for years and finally remember how to breathe again. May 1945, I was 12. I heard the church bells before I saw the crowds. Not the usual single toll for a funeral or a wedding, but a wild, joyous clanging that rolled over the hills like thunder made of hope. I ran outside barefoot, still in my nightshirt, and found Eleanor standing at the gate, her hand pressed to her mouth, tears tracking clean lines through the dust on her cheeks. She didn't say anything. She just reached for my hand, and we walked down to the green together. The whole village was there, farmers, shopkeepers, schoolchildren, even old Mr. Henshaw, who hadn't left his cottage since '41. Someone had strung bunting between the oaks, faded red and blue fabric fluttering like tired flags. A fiddle started up, then a mouth organ, then voices, rough, off-key, glorious. People hugged strangers. Women kissed soldiers' photographs. Children spun in circles until they fell over laughing. I stood at the edge of it all, heart pounding, not sure if I belonged in this joy. Then Tommy Briggs spotted me, grabbed my arm and pulled me into a clumsy jig that had us both tripping over our own feet. For a moment I forgot to be careful, forgot to be quiet. Forgot I was the boy from the train with the crooked name tag and the suitcase full of ghosts. That night, Eleanor lit every lamp in the house, even the ones she usually saved for special occasions, which until then had never come. We ate bread pudding made with real eggs and a spoonful of jam she'd been saving for peace. She didn't speak much, but her eyes kept finding me across the table, as if checking I was still there, still real. After supper, she brought out a small box from the back of the linen cupboard. Inside was a stack of letters tied with blue ribbon. My name was on the top one, in handwriting I hadn't seen in 2 years. Mum, my hands shook so badly I couldn't untie the knot. Eleanor didn't offer to help. She just sat quietly by the fire, mending a sock, giving me space to fall apart in my own time. The letter was short, dated March 1944. She wrote that the bakery had been hit during the Blitz, but she'd survived, taken shelter in the basement of the chemist's next door. She'd moved to Reading, found work in a canteen for factory workers. She asked if I was warm enough, if I was eating, if I remembered to say thank you. And then, at the very end, in smaller letters as if she were afraid to ask, "Do you ever think of me?" I read it 3 times, then folded it carefully and placed it back in the envelope. Eleanor didn't look up. "You can write back, you know," she said softly. "If you'd like," I nodded. But I didn't write that night, or the next. The words wouldn't come. Not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't know who I was writing to anymore. Was I still her son? Or was I becoming someone else? Someone shaped by quiet mornings in a stone cottage, by blisters from hoeing rows, by the way Eleanor always left the lamp on in the hall when I had nightmares. Weeks passed. The village settled into a new rhythm, less rationing, more chatter about the future. Men came home in uniform, some limping, some hollow-eyed. All changed. Mrs. Dobbs's boy returned with a German bayonet he kept under his bed, just in case. Life didn't snap back into place. It stitched itself together slowly, with loose threads and mismatched patches. One afternoon, I found Eleanor in the attic, sorting through an old trunk. Dust motes danced in the slanted light as she lifted out a child's shoe, tiny, leather, worn smooth at the heel. She held it for a long time, her thumb brushing the toe. "Was it yours?" I asked. She shook her head. "My brother's. Died of diphtheria when he was 5. Before the Great War." She placed the shoe back gently, as if it might break. "Funny, isn't it? How the world keeps taking children one way or another." I didn't know what to say. So I just sat beside her on the floorboards, shoulder to shoulder, watching the dust settle. That evening I wrote the letter. Not to explain, not to promise anything, just to say I'm safe, I'm well. I remember your humming. I remember the smell of your apron after baking. I remember you. I posted it the next day. A month later, a reply came. Shorter this time. She said she was glad, that she'd visit soon if that was all right. I showed the letter to Eleanor over supper. She read it slowly, then folded it and handed it back without comment. But that night, I heard her moving about long after bedtime, opening drawers, closing them, pacing the hall. When Mum came, it was on a Tuesday in late September. The air was crisp, the hedges heavy with blackberries. I saw her before she saw me, standing at the end of the lane in a coat too thin for the season, clutching a paper bag like a shield. She looked smaller than I remembered, tired. Her hair was shorter, streaked with grey she hadn't had before. I didn't run to her. I walked, slowly, as if approaching a bird that might fly away. Tommy, she said, her voice catching on my name like it was unfamiliar. Mum, she reached out, then hesitated, her hand hovering near my shoulder. I stepped forward and hugged her. She smelled of train smoke and lavender soap, different but not wrong. Eleanor met us at the gate. She'd put on her good dress, the one with the tiny pearl buttons. They nodded at each other. Two women who'd both lost something, both kept going. No jealousy, no tension. Just quiet recognition. We had tea in the garden. Mum asked about school, about the cat, about whether I still liked currant buns. I answered carefully, politely, as if speaking to a kind aunt, rather than the woman who'd sung me to sleep. She stayed 2 nights. Slept in the spare room. Left a tin of shortbread on the kitchen table before she left. After she'd gone, Eleanor and I stood in the doorway, watching the dust settle on the road. She's your mother, Eleanor said finally. I know. She loves you. I know that too. A pause, then softer. And you? I looked at her, at the lines around her eyes, at the flour still dusting her sleeve from baking that morning, at the way she always left the back door unlocked in case you forget your key. I love you both, I said. She didn't cry, but she squeezed my hand just once and went back inside to stir the stew. Winter came again. Colder this time. The village whispered about shortages, about strikes, about how peace wasn't as easy as they'd hoped. But in our house, the fire burned steady. One evening, while mending a tear in my school trousers, Eleanor said, "You could go back with her if you wanted. When she comes again." I looked up from my book.
"Do you want me to?"
She met my eyes. "I want you to be where you're loved." "I am," I said, and for the first time I meant it, not as a child clinging to safety, but as someone who'd learned that love isn't a single place. It's a choice, a daily act, a scarf knitted crookedly, a letter saved for years, a name spoken softly in the dark. That night I dreamed of London again. But this time, I wasn't alone on the platform. Eleanor was there holding my suitcase. Mum was there too, humming under her breath. And the train didn't take me away. It brought me home, whichever home that was, whichever home would have me. Time doesn't heal, not really. It just teaches you how to carry the weight without buckling. By the spring of 1947, I was 14, tall enough to reach the top shelf in the pantry, old enough to be trusted with the sheep during lambing season, and still not sure whether I belonged to London or to this quiet corner of Derbyshire. But I'd stopped asking myself that question so often. Instead, I learned to live in the in-between, the space where memory and present could share the same room without fighting. Mum wrote every month now, sometimes just a postcard with a picture of the Thames or a new factory canteen. Other times, longer letters filled with news of neighbours, of bread queues finally shortening, of her saving up for a flat with proper windows that open. She never pressed me to return, never guilted, just kept showing up in ink and paper like a quiet promise. I'm here. I haven't forgotten. Eleanor never read those letters, but she always knew when one arrived. She'd see me sitting at the kitchen table, pen in hand, brow furrowed over a reply, and she'd leave a cup of tea beside me without a word. Sometimes, if the weather was fine, she'd take the laundry outside and give me privacy. as if writing to my mother were a sacred thing, not a betrayal, but a bridge. That summer, we got word that the orphan trains were starting again, not for evacuation, but for reuniting. Children who'd been sent away during the Blitz were being offered passage back to their families if they wished to go. Posters went up in the village hall. Miss Hargreaves, older now, her hair fully silver, came to tea one afternoon and asked gently if I'd considered it. "I'm not an orphan," I said. Before I even realized I'd spoken, she smiled just a little. "No, Thomas, you're not." Eleanor said nothing during the visit. But that night, after I'd gone to bed, I heard her in the sitting room playing the piano, a small upright she rarely touched. It was out of tune, the keys yellowed with age. But she played a lullaby I'd never heard before, soft and slow, like she was tucking the whole house into bed. I lay there, listening, and understood she wasn't trying to keep me. She was trying to let me choose. The truth was, I didn't want to leave. Not because London held no pull, it did. In flashes, the smell of wet pavement after rain, the clatter of trams, the way Mum used to tuck my hair behind my ear when I was nervous, but because here I'd grown roots. Not the kind that trap you, but the kind that steady you. I'd learned to read the sky for rain, to tell a thrush from a blackbird by its song, to split logs without hitting my thumb. I'd fallen out of the apple tree twice and patched my own knees with dock leaves and spit. I'd sat with Eleanor through the long nights after the War Office letter, not speaking, just being there, like she'd been for me. This wasn't just shelter. It was belonging. One evening in August, as we shelled peas on the back step, I said, "I'm staying." She didn't look at me, just nodded, her fingers working steadily. "All right. I mean, for good." Now she paused, looked up. Her eyes were dry but bright, like sunlight on riverstones. "For good," she repeated, as if testing the shape of it. Then she reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small key. "Then you should have this." It was the key to the shed, the one with the rusted padlock where she kept tools, seed packets, and, I'd later learn, a box of letters from Arthur, her husband. Written from the trenches in 17, I took it. It was cold, heavy with meaning. "You're part of this place now," she said simply. "Not because I say so. Because you've made yourself so." That autumn I started secondary school in the next town over. Took the bus every morning with Tommy Briggs and 2 girls from the dairy farm. I wore my old coat still, though it was too short at the wrists, and carried my books in a satchel Eleanor had patched with canvas from an old grain sack. At school, I didn't talk much about where I'd come from. Not because I was ashamed, but because it felt too tender, like a bruise you don't want others to prod. But sometimes, during history lessons, when they spoke of the Blitz or evacuation, I'd catch the teacher's eye, and she'd pause just for a second before moving on. They knew, and they let me be. Back home, life settled into a rhythm that felt less like survival and more like living. Eleanor taught me how to bake bread, real bread, with a crust that sang when you tapped it. I taught her how to listen to the wireless without flinching at the news. We never said "I love you," not in words, but we said it in 100 other ways. In the way she saved the crusts for me, knowing I liked them best. In the way I'd bring her slippers before the fire on cold nights. In the silence that never felt empty, only full. Then in the spring of 48, Mum came again. This time she didn't stand at the end of the lane. She walked right up to the door and knocked like she belonged. She looked healthier, stronger even. Her coat was newer, her shoes polished. She brought a cake from a proper bakery in Reading and a photograph of us, taken just before I left London. I was small in it, clutching her hand, eyes wide with the kind of trust only children have. We sat in the garden again, but this time Eleanor joined us. They talked about the weather, about rationing finally ending, about how the trains were running on time again, polite, careful, but not cold. Later, as Mum helped me hang laundry, she said quietly, "You've grown." I have. She folded a shirt, mine, and smoothed the collar with her thumb. "You're happy here," it wasn't a question. "Yes," she nodded. Looked toward the house, where Eleanor was pruning the roses. "She's good to you, the best." Mum exhaled long and slow, like she'd been holding something tight for years and was finally letting go. "Then I'll stop asking." I turned to her. "You don't have to stop being my mother." She smiled then, a real one, tired but true. "I never stopped. But maybe love doesn't always mean keeping." That night before she left, she hugged me longer than before. And when she pulled away, she pressed something into my hand. The photograph. On the back she'd written, "My boy, always." After she'd gone, I found Eleanor in the kitchen washing the teacups. I didn't say anything, just stood beside her and started drying. We worked in silence for a while. Then she said, "She's a good woman." "She is. She loves you." "I know." Eleanor turned off the tap, dried her hands on her apron, looked at me, not as a child, not as a burden, but as someone she'd chosen and who'd chosen her back. "So do I," she said, and that was enough, more than enough, because in a world that had taken so much, we'd found something that couldn't be bombed, rationed, or evacuated. We'd found each other, not by accident, but by staying, by showing up, day after day, with tea and silence and crooked scarves and keys to sheds, by loving quietly, fiercely, without needing a name for it, and in that quiet love, I stopped being the boy from the train, became simply Thomas, Thomas who knew the taste of homegrown. Carrots. Thomas who could mend a fence and write a letter and sit with grief without running. Thomas who belonged not to one place, but to the spaces between, and that was freedom enough. I'm an old man now. My hands shake a little, and my knees creak like the floorboards in that old cottage. But my memory is sharp as a whetstone on a winter morning. It's the quiet moments that stay with you, not the grand ones. Not the sirens or the trains or the letters with official seals. No, it's the smell of bread rising under a damp cloth, the sound of a kettle beginning to sing, the way light fell through the kitchen window on a Tuesday in March, painting stripes across the table where two women who loved the same boy learned to share him without tearing him apart. I never went back to London to live, not permanently, but I visited, often in the beginning. Less so as the years passed, not from distance, but from peace. Mum and I found our rhythm. Letters, then phone calls, then Sunday afternoons with tea and tinned biscuits when I'd take the train down. She never remarried. Said she'd had her love and it was enough. I think she meant my father. But sometimes, when she looked at me, I wondered if she meant me too. Eleanor lived to be 92, died in her sleep just as she'd always said she would. No fuss, no bother. The day they buried her, I stood by the grave in the churchyard, the same one where Arthur's name was carved into cold stone, and I placed a single snowdrop on the fresh earth, the first of the season. She'd have liked that. After she was gone, I stayed in the cottage for a while. Not out of obligation, but because the walls still held her voice, the echo of her humming while kneading dough, the ghost of her footsteps on the stairs at dawn. I sorted her things slowly, reverently. In the back of the linen cupboard, behind stacks of neatly folded sheets, I found a shoebox. Inside were every letter I'd ever written to her, notes about school, postcards from trips, even a clumsy poem I'd penned at 16 about rain and sheep. She'd kept them all. Beneath them, wrapped in oilcloth, was my original name tag from the train, Thomas Ellis, age 10, destination unknown. I held it in my palm for a long time. The paper was brittle, the ink faded, but the words were still clear. Destination unknown, funny, isn't it? How we spend our lives searching for a destination when all along the journey is stitching us into place. I live in the village still. Though not in that house, it's someone else's home now, with a young family and a dog that barks at squirrels. I have a small flat above the old post office, with a view of the green and a window box I keep full of marigolds, just like Eleanor's. Children wave to me when I walk to the shop. They call me Mr. Ellis, and sometimes, if they're curious, the man from the train. I don't mind. In fact, I tell them stories, carefully, gently. Not of bombs or blackouts, but of kindness. Of how strangers can become family if you give them time. Of how a single cup of tea offered without expectation can be a lifeline. Last spring, a schoolteacher asked if I'd speak to her class about the war. I agreed, though I warned her I wouldn't talk about battles. Just about people, I said. So I told them about wet wool and burnt sugar, about a boy with a suitcase too big for his hands, about a woman who never said, "I love you," but showed it in every quiet act of care. Afterward, a girl with eyes like my mother's raised her hand. "Did you ever feel lost?" she asked. I thought for a moment. "Yes," I said. "But not for long, because someone chose to see me." And that made all the difference. Now, on quiet evenings, I sit by my window with a cup of tea, weak just how I like it, and watch the village settle into dusk. The same church bell tolls. The same curlew calls from the fields. Time folds in on itself sometimes, and I'm 10 again, standing on a platform, heart in my throat, not knowing that the unknown could hold such grace. They called us evacuees, orphans of circumstance, children of the Blitz, but we weren't just what was taken from us. We were what was given: a seat by the fire, a key to a shed, a scarf, lopsided but warm. Freedom wasn't a place on a map. It was the moment you realized you were safe enough to stay, and I stayed. Not because I had to, but because I was loved well enough to choose it. That's the thing they don't put in history books. Not the dates or the treaties or the troop movements, but this, that in the darkest chapters, ordinary people lit small candles, and those candles kept whole souls from going out. I still have that scarf. It's threadbare now, the blue and grey almost indistinguishable. But I keep it in my top drawer, folded neatly beside Mum's last letter and a photograph of Eleanor standing in her garden, smiling, not broadly but with her eyes. Sometimes, when the wind blows just right, I swear I can smell lavender and wood smoke, and for a moment, I'm home. Not the home I left, but the one that found me, the one that waited, the one that said simply, "Come on then. Supper's nearly ready," and I did, and it was.